difference between D&D and other tabletop RPGs. Hello and welcome. Today we'll be discussing the difference between Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop games. First, let's define what a tabletop game is. Essentially, these are games where players take on the role of characters in a fictional world and work together to complete quests or overcome challenges. The game is guided by a person called the Game Master or DM who creates the world and its inhabitants and serves as the narrator and referee of the game. Now, onto the main topic. What sets Dungeons & Dragons apart from other tabletop RPGs? Now, we're not saying that Dungeons & Dragons is the best, or better, or more correct in any way. Tabletop RPGs are very different and there are many of them, but Dungeons & Dragons is almost certainly the one that most people have heard of and is probably the most popular one in the world today. So what sets Dungeons & Dragons apart from other tabletop RPGs? One major difference is the setting. Dungeons & Dragons is primarily a fantasy game taking place in a world of magic, mythical creatures, and often medieval-like technology, though it can also be in dystopian or post-apocalyptic settings, even modern-day settings. But traditionally and from its roots, it's a sword and sorcery style game that's set in this post-medieval / Arthurian blend. Other tabletop RPGs often take place in a variety of settings. They're often linked to particular franchises, which might be related to books or movies, or they have a particular vibe to them. Maybe it's a science fiction, maybe it's post-apocalyptic mutant stories, it's a superhero story, or some other kind of setting that involves you playing a monster in a world of darkness, and more. There are so many different tabletop RPGs out there that we couldn't characterize them by putting them into 5 or 6 categories. Another difference is the system that's used for character creation and the gameplay itself. Dungeons & Dragons uses a system called D20, which is based primarily on rolling a 20-sided dice to determine the success or failure of actions. It's why you'll often see the D20, the 20-sided dice, as a symbol of Dungeons & Dragons. Other tabletop RPGs use different systems. They may use 20-sided dice, or they might use rolling 6-sided dice or 8-sided dice, or other randomizers perhaps. They might use other ways of bringing chance into it. You might use cards to determine actions, or perhaps a voting system. There are all kinds of ways of introducing chance, but Dungeons & Dragons primarily uses 20-sided dice. In terms of character creation, D&D has a set of specific races and classes that players can choose from, each with their own unique abilities and characteristics, many of which are very famous. Other tabletop RPGs may have a wider range of options, or allow players to create their own custom characters entirely from scratch. You can do this in Dungeons & Dragons, but the game doesn't do this by default. Another aspect that sets D&D apart is the extensive lore and history of the game. Dungeons & Dragons has been around since the 1970s and has a large dedicated player base, resulting in a vast amount of published material and resources available for players. Some other tabletop RPGs may not have as much history or published material, or they might have a more focused and specialized player base. That's not bad. Having a very active and energized player base may well allow new players to really become excited about a very specific thing. But sometimes it may also provide an intimidation factor that D&D has also had, but very much these days has tried to move beyond. Ultimately, the choice of tabletop RPG comes down to a personal preference. Do you prefer a fantasy setting or something else? Do you like the idea of rolling dice to determine outcomes, or do you prefer a different system? Do you want a lot of options for character creation, or do you prefer a more streamlined experience? All of these factors can help you decide what tabletop RPG is right for you. Maybe you want to play Dungeons & Dragons, but actually you don't really approve of how the business that owns Dungeons and Dragons, Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast, does business. I'm not casting any judgment there, but you could and then should choose another alternative. And there are open source versions of Dungeons and Dragons out there using the Open Gaming License. There's a game known as Pathfinder that branches from the same route of Dungeons and Dragons, and there are other versions of fantasy games out there that are there as alternatives for, let's say, folks that don't want to play D&D but want to play D&D. I hope this video has helped shed some light on the differences between Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop RPGs. Thanks for watching and see you next time.